Hello and welcome back to Bad Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at Bad Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. Alright, I'm very excited for today's guest. Srephen R. Bown is one of Canada's leading writers of nonfiction. He's the winner of the 2024 Governor-General's Award for Popular History, the Pierre Berton Award, and the author of The Company and Dominion. Together, those two books tell the story of how Canada was built, from the early reach of the Hudson's Bay Company to the construction of a railway that bound the country from coast to coast. Srephen's work doesn't flatter or condemn the past. It tries to understand it. He argues that for too long we swung between extremes, seeing our ancestors as either saints or villains, and that popular history should return to the middle ground, acknowledging the good, the bad, and the human. In this conversation, we talk about that balance, how history is never fixed, but always alive, and how individual will from figures like John A. Macdonald can change the course of a nation. We also discuss the craft of telling these stories in a way that connects modern readers to the people who live them. Srephen R. Bown is the author of 11 acclaimed works of history, including Scurvy, The Last Viking, and The Merchant Kings. You can follow his work and current projects at his personal website, which I'll include in the show notes. It's an incredible honor to welcome to the show, Srephen R. Bown. Srephen R. Bown, welcome to Bad Canadians. It is a real pleasure to have you on the show here.
Pleasure to be here, and I hope I'm not a bad Canadian.
Only in the best way I think possible. I invited you on the show because I read your two latest books, The Dominion and The Company. I'm really happy just to have found you as an author with the back. I can't wait to dig into your back catalog, which looks just as interesting. But full disclosure, I hadn't heard of you until Dominion, and I went to go buy Dominion and saw that you had released The Company prior to that, so it just kind of made sense to read that first, and so I picked it up instead, and just found it captivating. It just pulled me in. It was one of these experiences where when I was finished reading The Company, like next day Amazon delivery was not good enough. I found myself in the car driving to the bookstore. Within 30 minutes, I was back home reading Dominion. And, that kind of being captivated like that, just, I'm used to that in fiction sometimes, but to have nonfiction just pull me in like that was, just amazing. And I did notice, I invited you on because I noticed you had a bit of what I felt was a bit of a contrarian style of approaching popular history. And I was kind of hoping we could get into that conversation, have a bit broader of a conversation about popular history and where it's at today and your way of approaching it. But I just think we can't get around just talking for a few minutes about these two beautiful books you did write. And so I was just curious. Writers are often on a spectrum. Some writers are like, the writing process is torturous. It's something they endure to, create this product at the end. And on the other side, there's writers who find it pleasurable and it's, they enjoy the process. And I was wondering, what was your experience writing these two books? Are you someone who gets pleasure out of this research and writing, or is it a bit of something you work through and have to endure?
This is kind of a wishy-washy answer. I'm a bit of both. There's parts of it I really enjoy. And for me, it's uncovering, searching for, finding stories of the little people who are living, the little people in quotes, like not the big politicians or the massive financiers, but the people who are just living their normal lives in the context of these large tectonic political or cultural developments, and inserting their voices and their stories into the overarching narrative. So for me, that is fascinating. I read so many accounts and little travel logs, and whether they're recent or recently discovered, or whether they're translated from older ones or whatever, and I find them, and I find something special. I'm just so happy to find something that illustrates some little moment of humanity that will just bring a different perspective to the story. And for me, that's so exciting and so fulfilling. And I find that, I tell it up as a story, I put it somewhere, and I say, I don't know where this is going to go, but it's going to go in somewhere, and it's going to be interspersed with this sort of more hardcore, more factual or data-driven histories to sort of break it up. And I want it to be information and then human aspect, human story, and I want them to flip back and forth so that the story is, I think it provides a better overall picture of the way the world used to be and how people used to live their lives and how people could be affected indirectly by the events of us, large developments that are going on in the society around them, but not specifically, but their role might not be specifically related to the topic of the book. And for me, that's the greatest thing, is finding those stories and putting them in and just revealing a different aspect of life back then. The part that I find a little bit challenging or a bit of a slog is when there's a large chunk of dense historical information and I think to myself, I can't actually get away with not having this in here. It's not making my heart sing to do it, but it's got to be done, And, that's the same with almost any job, though, really. Parts of it we really love, and parts of it are just kind of necessary obstacles on the path to some greater good or whatever.
So are those two things related then? Are you finding that to get through that tougher, maybe fact-based, that introducing a human element to it kind of makes it more approachable?
Well, that is my belief, and I get a lot of credit for doing that, and so yeah, I think that is. I mean that's my objective anyway, is to reveal the world, bring it alive in a way that just sort of dry statistics and data doesn't. And I want them to blend together. So it's not just a story devoid of context, but it's not just the context devoid of a human element. And I want them both so that people can maybe have a little more empathy for the lives that people, the challenges and the difficulty of life in these time periods. But as well be just perhaps inspired by it, or just open up a way of thinking about either contemporary society or historical society that's a little bit different than what they would have imagined,
Yeah. No, I think for me, I can feel like, I think when I tell you I had to rush out and go out and buy the second book right away. And I think in my letter to you, I talked about how it kind of sent me down a rabbit hole of just being lost in, 16, 17, 1800s and all my fiction and research and everything. And, I just finished this TV show Barkskins last week. So I'm still not even out of this rabbit hole yet. And I do feel like it's that being able to relate to those small human stories that really create that, pulling me into the story and making me really imagine being in it. And just for months, I just imagined walking through tall grasslands and just, going into these untouched lands and just imagining how these people felt as they were doing it. It's just, very compelling.
But I'm just gratified to hear you say that, because that's one of my main objectives, is to make people perhaps empathize with what's going on in the past, rather than just having it being an intellectual exercise. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, maybe because your genre of history, would it technically fall in the popular history genre?
That
would you want to just speak to what that is in relation to other forms of history?
Yeah, I mean, look there. I mean, all of that. There's more of an academic history, which is more data driven, more it'll be just the facts and perhaps trying to lead up to some kind of an argument. But it's the flip side of the coin of that is bringing the more human element into it. And popular history is known for doing that. I mean, but of course, within any of these genres, there's a spectrum. I mean, some popular history is so light on the history, it's not really, there's not enough factual basis on it to justify some of the conclusions or some of the opinions that are coming out of it. And some of the academic history, so far into statistics, you start to, and points and out of context quotes or just data, that you kind of lose don't even really know why you're learning it. Like, are you just memorizing it for, you know what I mean? So that I know there's a reason for, hardcore academic history. And in fact, writing popular history is impossible to do without that fundamental research that's been laid down by people, perhaps over generations, going through the archives, collecting up the statistics and the data and having it all at your fingertips. I mean, I appreciate, from my point of view, it's impossible. I couldn't spend an entire career collecting up the data that then I would just use. It would take me a whole lifetime to put that together. So it's extremely important for it to be out there. But for me, who's trying to communicate to a broader audience, and that's my objective is to make people who might not have an interest in history to gain some knowledge of it, and therefore be able to see how it might apply to our society now, and at least understand where we came from and how it's a process of social evolution and technological evolution or political evolution between now and then. And there isn't such a thing as which I notice now out in the media and in public perception. There seems to be an idea that there's now our current dynamic, fully fleshed society that's evolving and changing and is really alive. And then there's this line at some indeterminate point in the past. And beyond that line is something called history. And it's like, a black and white or a sepia-toned photograph, permanently set and unmoving. And there it is, history. It never changes. And of course, that's absurd. There's always, change is one of the most, change is always around us. It's everywhere. There's no way to avoid it. And that societies and people who live their lives within those societies from hundreds of years ago also felt that they were living in a dynamic and changing world, and that between the generations things were not the same. There was new developments, there was new technology, there was new politics, there was new ideas around all the time back then, just as there is now. And so if you talk about the 1890s, that is not the same as the 1860s, and that's not the same as the 1830s, and it's not the same as the 1790s, So sometimes it's very frustrating to me when someone without a historical background wants to have an opinion, and they throw it out there, and they cherry pick a bunch of quotes, 100 years apart, and just put it all together and say, see, problem solved. This is what everyone thought. I'm thinking, man, these things are like 120 years apart. They are most certainly not coming from the same point of view. Everything is changing between the generations. Think of just within our lifespan. When I went to university in the 1980s, we didn't have any computers. Essays were researched in a library with physical books, and you used a card catalog to find them, and you typed up your essay on a typewriter. Yeah. It's the whole, just within my lifespan, there's been this enormous change. And now I could do a whole month of work by flicking on my keyboard as I'm sipping on a nice cup of coffee looking out the window up here. It's big changes happening. And so not every period of time has those same level of change, but change is a constant. And I don't know what our original question even was.
No, but I think you captured that in your books really well. I think even between those two books, The Company and Dominion, you see right through from the beginning of in the late 1600s, when 1670 and trade begins with the indigenous populations and the English and the French coming in, and how it's just I didn't realize how constant that change was, just from wooden fish hooks to metal hooks to having steel axes, and just those small introductions of technology, and just how much that completely upturns everything, and your Dominion starts with that idea of dynamite, and the invention of dynamite, and how much that just allowed all these massive infrastructure projects. It was just, the whole two books were just full of change. It just felt like you could really feel it. It was, yeah.
Oh, I'm glad that you noticed that, because that's one thing I always was thinking about. It was wow, from everything a sewing needle. I remember thinking, I was at Rocky Mountain House, a historic site in western Alberta, where there was a famous fur trade post. It's sort of west of Red Deer in the foothills, and I was going through there and they were showing this little sewing needle, and they were saying, the little plaque was saying, the sewing needle would trade for 6 pelts or something like that, whether it was beavers or wolves or something, I don't know. And I was thinking, wow, that needle gets a lot of wolves for one little needle. Is that a fair exchange? And then I was thinking, okay, let's imagine we're this needle. Let's go all the way back across thousands and thousands kilometers across the land. Now we go across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, into a cold northern island where there's a bunch of exploited coal miners hammering away at some seam of metal below the ground with hand picks, chipping at the iron to get it out. They're rolling it on carts out of the ground. Then this iron ore is shipped off by probably a horse train or oxen cart. I don't know what it would have been in the 17th century. It's not a railway. Anyway, they had to get it from there to somewhere where it was melted down and smelted with all the toxic fumes going all over. These guys are probably dying young from lung diseases or whatever. Then they get the ore. The ore is then put into mold, melted. Some of it gets turned into a little tiny little needles. Then those needles get made into sharpened little thing by someone. Then those things get transported to the city of London and packed into a box and loaded onto some creaky old sailing ship with a bunch of sails on it, all made of wood. And it works its way of a month and a half or 2 months across the ocean with the sailors maybe dying of scurvy or something like that. They get all the way in the ice-infested, choked waters of Hudson's Bay, and they, they get down there living in what level of hardship that these people are enduring is beyond anything that we can even conceive of in our world right now as just regular Canadians, Then they unload it at a fort on the frozen rim of Hudson's Bay. It gets packed around. It gets maybe traded with some indigenous traders. And one interesting thing, which I pointed out in the book, is much of the inland trade for over a century was actually run by indigenous inland business operations. Mm-hmm. The Hudson's Bay Company were like Costco distributor ships on the coast, and so these business transportation businesses run by indigenous business leaders would do the exchange en masse, trade in some pelts. They would get some of these needles. They'd spend months and months paddling in huge brigades of canoes deep into the interior of the continent. A whole season. It could be the next spring they finally get there, or the winter, or whatever. They get out into the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains, thousands of kilometers from where they began, and they unload it from these canoes, and they travel it up, and the person who gets out that thing looks at it and goes, wow, that thing is extremely valuable, that little sewing needle. Think of how that would transform the life of, there's primarily women doing the sewing back then, but how that would transform the life of someone to get that. All of a sudden you can, and the thimble that would have gone with it, and you could push it through. It probably like tripled their productivity in the production of clothing, let's just say, or shelter or materials or anything, you know what I mean? Extremely useful, extremely valuable, improved someone's life immeasurably. For them to have changed 6 pelts or whatever it was for that thing would have been considered like, oh, that's a fair deal. It's worth 6. Because, exchange itself being a mutual agreement between parties, that was the value of it.
Agreed upon value.
Yeah, and so when I think of it that way, it makes me go, wow, the value that we place on things changes over time too. Sewing needles worth nothing now. If one dropped on the ground, out on my driveway, I wouldn't be concerned that I lost something valuable. I'd be concerned that I hope it doesn't stab the tire of my car.
Yeah, well, you can also see in that everything you just described there how valuable the needle is, in that it also is tiny. So it's valuable, and you can also just pack a ton of thimbles and needles into containers, and now you have something really tiny and valuable, so you can bring a ton of them into the new world and trade away with them, as opposed to like even an axe head, I guess, is a lot bigger and heavier to lug around,
Yeah, axes would have been worth 12 pelts or some equivalent,
Yeah,
because of their size.
I was shocked at how much they were pulling out. Like when I saw some of the diaries of just how many pelts one trading post was bringing out in a season.
Yeah, tens of thousands of these things.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it's incredible. And they were, of course, the effort to get those out and to bring the stuff in to get them. They were extremely valuable too. To an indigenous hunter who's living on the land, what's a beaver pelt? Okay, it took them a couple of days to catch one or something, but they were worth a lot more in Europe to those people than they were over here, which is how whole commerce and trade works, really.
Yeah.
For all the hats, the waterproof, malleable fabric that can be shaped into all different, different styles and used for different purposes. There was no Gore-Tex back then. It was, the felt made from the fur. So that's the way the world was. And with dynamite, as you mentioned, holy cow, what a transformation. That's a classic example of how a technological revolution bred a political revolution and a social revolution, because with that dynamite, all of a sudden, things that were just, why even dream about that? It's impossible, But a dynamite 10 times the explosive capacity of black powder, but because it's so small, you could bore a hole into the rock and stuff the little stick of dynamite into the rock and blast the rock outwards instead of just piling up a mountain of kegs of gunpowder lighting a fuse and running like hell and hoping it doesn't, then you're blasting into the rock instead of having it blast out. I mean, the transformation of society almost instantaneous with all the bridges and the canals and the railways and the roads and the harbors all cleared up and the foundations for buildings and cities. I mean, it was so rapid that its transformation of Europe and North America as it penetrated into the more civilized areas, that there you go. One year we didn't have dynamite, and the next year we did, and everything, all those famous industrial mega projects were all done since the discovery of that one thing. And of course that allowed just people like John A. Macdonald to even imagine the idea that you could have a railway. And if you can have a railway, then you can imagine that you can have a country, because then you can communicate within the country, and you can have an internal commerce system, which would be inevitable if you can't have a country with no way of traveling within it. And after Canada was made, just the original Canada along the St. Lawrence Seaway, it wasn't a seaway then, the St. Lawrence River, the only way to get to the rest of what they imagined they wanted to be Canada, the Pacific colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia, you had to travel to the United States to get there. And you think, well, how long are we going to remain a unified political entity if you cannot get, between the different components of this political entity? But as soon as you had dynamite, you could imagine the railway, and then you could say, well, we can pound a railway across the Canadian Shield and across the mountains and connect to this British Columbia. And we can, John A. Macdonald had a dislike of Americans and American culture, and he just didn't want them to own everything, which they inevitably, absolutely would have claimed all of it if it wasn't for the fact that the railway enabled the country of Canada. But of course, he had no idea. He was a politician. He had no idea of the technical challenges that building this railway would entail. He looked around a little bit and said, I'm just going to go and say that we're going to build it, and it's going to be done in less than 10 years. And I'm going to make the promise. I'm going to sign the document. I'm going to get British Columbia to join with us. And but someone might have said to him, are you sure you can do that? Because I don't care. I'm just doing it anyway. And that's where the whole idea of Canada extending out to the Pacific Ocean was. And that's why I started the book Dominion, not in Montreal or Ottawa, where the idea was conceived in the first place, but in Victoria, because I just wanted to highlight the fact that in Victoria at that time, all of the commerce, all of the political connections, the economy, the social connections was with San Francisco. And the Americans had just purchased Alaska to the north, hemming it into the north. To the west, or to the east, was an impenetrable series of mountain ranges with no road system or anything connecting to it. And to the south was the American colonies, and everything having to do with British Columbia and Vancouver Island was associated with San Francisco. So when these people wanted to send delegates east to discuss the possibility of political union with Canada instead of the United States, which was the inevitable conclusion, or was believed that was inevitable, they had to, ironically, take a steamship to San Francisco, ride on an American railroad, which had just been completed, and then come back up into Canada on the other side. They must have, I don't know, I'm sure they appreciated the irony of the whole idea of traveling through one foreign country in order to enter a different foreign country to discuss the possibility of joining that foreign country that you can't even get to this country, and there's no connection between it at all, right? I mean, it's kind of...
Yeah, reading those two books, you see that it's a small miracle many times that we're just not America.
Oh!
It's a small America. Canada exists at all. And you talk about technology, and, technology, I think, is often overlooked in history, but obviously it's a major driver of history, technology. But what I saw as your contrarian angle too is you did focus on the big people of history a bit more, certain individuals, their will, their ambition, their drive, and so just mentioning John A. Macdonald there, and so I'd ask you, I guess, let's say the week before Alfred Nobel declares that he has created dynamite, let's say John A. Macdonald falls off his horse and dies suddenly. What percentage chance do you think Canada exists today?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting exercise in speculation. I would say zero, I mean, it was his kind of idea. I mean, he was the guy that disliked Americans, and he was the one that was always pushing for the concept. There were other people who were going along with it, but it was his. He was the motivating force behind the whole concept. I mean, he was one of the main motivating forces for the creation of the original Canada and some of the Atlantic colonies and Ontario or Quebec or Upper and Lower Canada. He was the one who dreamt of it extending to the Pacific, and he brought a lot of other people along with him. And he used that political capital. Basically, his entire career was devoted towards making it happen. So, you know, Canada is his creation. We would all be Americans. Well, I don't know, maybe we wouldn't even exist. But, you know, all of the prairies were already drawn also into the American orbit. The commerce there, to the extent that there was commerce, that was independent of the indigenous commerce, which was thrown into disarray because of the severe depletion of the bison herds and disease and encroaching American whiskey traders coming in there. The non-indigenous commerce was often done with paddle wheel ships that were coming up from the U.S. So it was already being drawn into the American orbit economically, and it would have politically it was kind of independent anyway, as we know, we had two real rebellions sort of resisting the idea of Canada encroaching upon what they viewed to be their independent territory. So, and as we just mentioned, BC almost inevitably would have been drawn into the American orbit. It already was in the American orbit. So, yeah.
So do you see your style of writing history as contrarian?
I try to. I try to do a little bit.
In the modern moment?
Yeah, I try to do a little bit of blowing and sucking at the same time, as you probably noticed. You know, it's hard to do, but I like to push one thing and then push another little thing, just to make people think a little bit. Like,
you seem comfortable sitting in moral complexity in history.
Yeah, because I'm not someone who is an extreme ideologue. In fact, I dislike extreme partisan politics or extreme points of view, but I know that they're out there, and I like to understand what they are or what they were, and point out that there's a legitimate reason in most cases for some of these ideas to have existed, but it's not inevitable that one is going to triumph over another, and there are not any extreme positions are no more sensible back then than they are now, really. You know what I mean? Yeah. But people get it in their mind that that's what they want to believe, and that stems from their experience or their lives that they were living, because everyone's living a different life and everyone's thinking about things from a different perspective. So you don't want to dismiss it out of hand either. But I like to sort of say, imagine this and then imagine that, and just to make people realize, well, politics now is filled with dissenting opinions. Well, it was then too. There was always a different point of view being raised, and not all different points of view are irrelevant. Maybe some of them would have been better. I don't know. I wouldn't want to impose a moral judgment on things like that. We only know what happened, you know, not what could have happened or what didn't happen. Despite your exercise in speculation that you made me go on there a little bit, which is good to do as well. But, you know, what we know is what happened, and we can try and infer from that what people were thinking, because not everyone was on board. Some people were resisting. Some people were having a dissenting opinion. Politics comes in, whether it's to determine, you know, where to open a fur trade outpost from a company's point of view, or where to situate a railway from a railways company's point of view, or, you know, if you're an indigenous person, are you going to be wrapped into the economy the way that it seems to be going? Are you going to try and change it? Are you going to resist the railway? Or are you going to try and work with it? I mean, all people from all different backgrounds all have to respond to these events that are going on within their lives and try and chart a course for themselves that results in the best thing possible for themselves and their people and their families or whatever, just like today. And so the world is enormously complex, and I know it's impossible to cover all of it, but I want to cover enough of it just so that its complexity is at least revealed, even if it's not complete, and never can be complete really either. I mean, you could write a 50,000 word book and it still wouldn't include everything. You know what I mean?
I can imagine when you're
Yeah.
reading those little diaries, travel logs, it must be really tough for you not to include so many little things in there. It must be tough to have to put things on the cutting room floor.
Yep. Yeah. You want ones that are illustrative, but you can't have too many that are this illustrating the same thing, you know. And so,
Yeah.
how do you balance out? Like, I mean, for some, it's actually very easy. When I was talking about the the Chinese laborers on part of the CPR rail in BC, which was incredible. Like over 600 of these people actually died building small sections of that railway, blasting it through the mountains and the passes in the Fraser Canyon. Um, it's oddly enough, there was very little information on that was written from the perspective of any of those Chinese workers. So that's a rare example of where there was hardly any information. Usually there's too much, exactly like you were talking about. But in this case, there was only one single journal written by a Chinese CPR worker during that whole time of any significant length or insight. And the reason for that is because many of the Chinese workers were coming, let's call them exactly what they were, the temporary foreign workers of the 1870s and 1880s, right? They weren't expected to stay here. They were imagined that they would come here, do some work, and then go back to China, right? And they were brought in, and they were paid lower wages than the other railway workers, which of course caused a great deal of conflict between the different working groups, because one felt one is completely illiterate in their own language because they came from the uneducated peasant class in China, and were fleeing civil war and famine and disease, and were just happy to be able to eat, and let alone being able to speak or read and write English. But from the other point of view, they're trying to increase their wages in the late rise of the labor union movement, and they're trying to improve working conditions. And then all of a sudden, these foreign workers are arriving in, and they're being paid less and have it undermines their bargaining power, right?
Yeah.
So you can see the conflict. The seeds of the conflict are already embedded in it right then.
Yeah.
But we only have one journal of one person, and it's because that person was owing to a murder of his father, which is interesting little backstory too. He was an educated, sort of a Mandarin class. His father was murdered. The family was thrown into turmoil and lost their position within the upper class society, and he was forced to flee. And that's how he ended up joining a ship, thinking, there's no future for me here. My family's disgraced, and that's the way their system worked back then. And everything, as I was mentioning, was disease and civil war and whatnot. So he left and joined the work, not knowing really what it was going to be like for him when he got there. And of course, it was hard work. It was horrible, and he wasn't used to physical labor. He was a person who was highly educated and trained in poetry and law and whatnot. Anyway, he got there, and he spent a decade as a general laborer, working in the most incredibly dangerous conditions, seeing the disease and the scurvy and the malnutrition and the rock falls coming on the people, and the discrimination that they faced, and what it was like in the winter and what it was like in the summer. He wrote this incredible account of it. No one knew about this until several years ago. That's how rare the document is. It was in someone's attic, and part of it was destroyed by fire. Part of it was discovered, translated, and is available now. And that's how I was able to, bring alive that aspect of the story too, which was a perspective which, if you go back to older books from like half a century ago or more, like the original Pierre Berton books on that, they don't have anything on Chinese workers. I think there was a page and a half in the entire mighty 2-volume series he wrote on the railway. Partly because that was only of tangential interest, I think, back then, and partly because the material didn't exist. So, yeah. Anyway,
Did you know what happened to that gentleman?
Well, he lived his life. He did manage to bring a wife over from China, and they had a whole bunch of children. They lived in
So his descendants of populated Canada.
Oh, they have. So, the one who was, wouldn't want to. This is sort of public knowledge because it was in the foreword to the book that I read. But I mean, one of them was in Ottawa as a civil servant. Maybe a granddaughter or great-granddaughter, probably. Right. Anyway, there you go. It's interesting to think of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Just returning back to the topic of popular history, then you were kind of mentioning that you feel like you do have a bit of a contrarian style, and maybe going back to the other side of that, then is like, how would you summarize modern, more contemporary popular history? Like, what are your concerns with it more specifically, if you are trying to do something a little different?
Well, I mean, history had fallen out of favor for a while in the sense that I don't think there was a lot of it being necessarily being written or being read. I mean, there were little stories, but no big stories. You know what I mean? Like there might be a biography of one person or a very micro history of this little region, but none of the big grand overarching tales like what I'm trying to do were being done for quite a while. And I think history became involved in politics such that it was hard to separate it from political agendas. And let's just simplify the whole political agenda thing and said there's people who wanted to view everyone in the past as devils and people who wanted to view everyone in the past as angels. And the devil group was, everyone's an evil an evil white supremacist colonizer who's out, were nasty, malevolent people out to cause as much damage as they possibly could to the world and were just generally despicable and evil. Okay, now let's set that aside. And then you have the more traditionalists saying, those were our ancestors. They need to be venerated. They were all heroic. We should be celebrating them. They're, these things are like two ends of a spectrum, and neither has any bearing upon reality at all, if you ask me. They're not any of those things. They're not devils or angels. They're just people, complex people. And some of them had, like, let's say they had devilish aspects to their personality. Well, they also had angelic aspects to their personality, too. They're just exactly like us, but they're living in a very different technological and political and social environment than we are. And their education was completely different. And their ability to effect change upon the world around them was severely constrained by the lack of knowledge, the lack of transportation, the lack of communication. Things that we take for granted that we can do in 2 seconds. Like, well, I don't know. We just walk to the grocery store. We buy some healthy food whenever we want to. Back then, that's impossible. Well, I just look. A classic example that might illustrate that is the Great Buffalo Famine, as I would call it, on the Canadian prairies. For 10,000 years, or however many thousands of years, these buffaloes were everywhere. Whole societies or groups of people existed upon chasing them and following them or hunting them, living off them. All aspects of their society revolved around having access to the buffalo. It was a major food source, but it was also the source of their clothing and the source of their shelter and whatnot. And it had been in decline through the 19th century since, various traders were around and the guns and the horses were allowing them to be hunted with greater ability than ever before. But there were still a lot of them. But then the U.S. government had its policy, the famous warfare between the cavalry and the various different tribes that were down in the U.S. And one of their policies was we need to hunt these, kill all the buffalo, and that'll kill their food source. And so they were actively slaughtering tens of thousands, millions of these things for no real reason, just shooting them and letting them rot on their prairies. And sometimes their pelts were also extremely valuable for the Industrial Revolution. They were being turned into machine belts. So someone would go and cut the hide off of it, ship it back east to go into the factories and run the machine belts. And that's where millions of these animals ended up being killed. But of course, a buffalo doesn't understand an imaginary political boundary. Why the hell would it? I hardly understand an imaginary political boundary sometime, right? Some diplomats in Europe agreed that there's a thing called the 49th parallel, and to the north of it is going to be controlled by this empire, and the south of it is controlled by a different thing. Well, the buffalo just says, oh, there's a nice piece of grass, and I'm going to go over there and eat it, right? And
Yeah.
all of a sudden he's on one side of a line or another. Anyway, they just wander all over. So killing them on one side of the line is effectively killing them on the other side of the line. And that all came to a head in the 1870s and early 1880s when they more or less disappeared as a food source for tens of thousands of people. That happened very rapidly, much quicker than anyone anticipated that it was going to happen. And there was widespread famine all over the prairies. Indigenous people were starving, which weakened them, which made them more susceptible to disease, which increased the conflicts between groups over the diminishing food source, which also was killing off a lot of people. This is a horrible time if you were at all involved with any of those groups. So, yeah, a really nasty period of time. The angel side would say, oh, well, let's just say, the angel side would just say, nothing we could have done about that. It's not our problem. And the devil side would say, they didn't do anything to alleviate the starvation. It's because they were malevolent and racist. And I'm thinking, well, obviously it's a bit of both, right? I mean, it is the Canadian problem because Canada at that time wanted to have political control over that land. Well, if you're wanting to assert political control over that land, then those are your people. And you do have a responsibility to your own people. So you can't assert political control to a land and then say that you're not going to have any responsibility for the people who live there and you're going to let them starve to death.
Well, in that point too, in your book, didn't you say they already signed the treaties, like the Treaty 6, and they've kind of included that care and taking care of it?
Exactly, yeah. So they had already just recently promised to do that. But they weren't imagining that 2 years later they were going to have to make good on their promise. They thought, oh, that's going to be some time in the future, and it's not our problem right now. That's a problem for. It was like, you know, when Homer Simpson is saying, that's a problem for future me. Gee, I'd hate to be that guy. You know? But I mean, the government, they agreed to all these responsibilities, such as feeding and care of people if there was going to be any kind of disaster like that. And they weren't anticipating that a year or two later, they were going to be called upon to do that. But on the other hand, there's no railway built yet. There's no road, obviously. There's no river system that gets there. Right. In fact, it's impossible to get to this land except by canoe over a period of several months of hard travel. So you're not going to be able to bring in large amounts of famine relief if you can't even get there from anywhere. And what they were doing was shipping the food south into the United States, a foreign country, traveling west on American railways, loading it onto American paddle wheelers, and trying to use American networks to bring it across the border into the prairies. You can imagine that at a time when the political rulership of those lands is at question, and there's manifest destiny, and the Americans are thinking of claiming it, pointing out the fact that you don't even have access to your own land, and you're using them to provide food relief to you, theoretically, who are supposed to be your own people, exposes a great weakness in your plans, you know what I mean? So there's no version of that famine that wasn't going to happen. I think they could have done more, but it's not going to ever relieve. It's impossible, because where was this food going to come from? We're already dealing with an early industrial society. There isn't a lot of excess food even within that system. I mean, horsepower still meant how much your horse could pull at that time, right? I mean, farms are not anywhere near as productive as they are now. There's no diesel-powered tractors going around. No, it was
It almost seems similar to how the Hudson Bay Basin was such a huge network that was feeding into that whole trade empire. The buffalo also had connections just right through so much of North America, right? You know, it was even affecting them. That would be affecting, I guess, the Métis communities all the way in Manitoba who, you know, did that migration back and forth. And so you'd be having to get relief across the entire prairies, essentially, I guess. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like an enormous undertaking. I mean, that would be a challenge for any government now to do that. And I think we would do an infinitely better job than they did back then. But that's where the understanding of the technology level in the past impacted their actual ability to solve that problem. They couldn't solve that problem to the way that we can do it now. I think they could have done a better job, and I've read a little bit about it, and there were some arguments in the House of Commons that are, you know, downright repulsive to read, some of it, coming from both political parties. So in fact, it was John A. Macdonald who was arguing more in favor of doing it, and he was being hammered by the Liberal opposition, saying those are savages and that's not our responsibility. And they were hammering him before upcoming elections in Ontario, saying they're trying to steal the value of your labor and send it out to those people in some foreign land that we've never been to and that we don't want. You know, some of these arguments are, well, just a little bit odd. I mean, back then the politics was that because it was John A. Macdonald's idea to have country, some in the Liberal opposition were opposed to the idea of the country and didn't care about it to the same extent. And so there's that dynamic, just because of partisan politics, one had to take the other side to the opposing side. And so, yeah.
I get the impression you feel that, you can speak to this and tell me if I'm wrong. I get the impression you feel that Johnny MacDonald's been kind of unfairly vilified in the present day talk of history.
I think
Is that true?
it's gone too far, I think.
Okay.
He, of course, used to be viewed as the great nation-building hero who could do no wrong, which, of course, is clearly not the case. I mean, look, he was corrupt beyond belief, on a whole bunch of different levels. But he wasn't evil, and I don't believe he hated or had any malicious intent towards any Indigenous people. In fact, he was urging for them to be given the vote. And he did give them, male Indigenous people, the vote in certain regions, and the Liberals took it away as soon as he lost the election after his death. So I think it's too far to say he's the great force of evil. It's actually just not true. Was he perfect? Absolutely not. He made all kinds of problematic decisions, but sometimes they were because they were compromised decisions based upon political realities of that time. Like, yes, he did introduce a head tax on Chinese workers being brought into the country as foreign workers, $50 per head to come in. The reason he did that, he was opposed to it, was because the labor unions and the opposition in British Columbia was demanding that he do something to prevent foreign Chinese workers from coming in and undermining the wages of the actual workers. And so, that's the political reality that he was dealing with. And so his $50 a head was later by Wilfrid Laurier, after MacDonald's death. Laurier brought in $500. He upped it to $500 under the, falling prey to the same pressures. So I don't know. Does that mean that they're the evil racists for putting a price on foreign immigration? Or
I guess he gets brought up in the architect of the residential school system as one of the main critiques on him lately.
That is true. And I've even thought about that. It was very small. Most residential schools were actually created and run after MacDonald's death. He died in 1891. I mean, even some of these ones like in Kamloops, where they found the disturbed... I was reading an article where they were mentioning the soil disturbances and the potential for human remains being there. And then they mentioned MacDonald's residential school. And then they mentioned that the residential school was founded in 1896. MacDonald had been dead for 5 years at that point. Like, not out of politics, like dead. How could...
Was it also later that it became mandatory? Was it mandatory at that point in his life to go to a residential school?
There were periods when it was mandatory for certain people, and there were periods when it wasn't. I mean, there's no... Once again, because there's so much change over time, you can't say, oh, it was this or oh, it was that. It was a whole bunch of really bad things, and I would never try. And I've read some of the things that went on there, and it's repulsive. It's a dark period in the, when it was at its worst phases. It's a dark time for sure. But there were also times when it wasn't a dark time. I think you could say, oh, some of it depended on who was in charge. Okay, if you had a good person, then you weren't sexually and physically and psychologically abused. Oh, gee, yay. I got a good, the dice rolled up and I got a good one, That's not, that's not a ringing endorsement of an entire system. But I think the concept, the Ryerson fellow originally wrote about, decades before, he died too, long before. They say that he was an architect of it, too, but I don't understand how you could be an architect of something after you're dead. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But the idea that you should have boarding schools exist in all different societies. I mean, there's the famous English boarding schools are still around. Like the idea of bringing people to a school when you can't bring a school to the people is not inherently an evil idea. It's just how it was implemented, who was placed in charge of it, that's where all the problems came from. But most of the Indigenous peoples who went to residential schools had nothing to do with John A. Macdonald, because he died in 1891, and a lot of those schools were expanded under the Wilfrid Laurier government.
Yeah.
you know.
So would it be too simplistic to say maybe in history we started off a couple generations ago being too angelic and we needed a critique was necessary, and so we started forming a critique, but then eventually the critique became too much and the critique became everything, and we just kind of have to find ourselves a bit more in with nuance again, and
Yeah.
being able to bring that nuance back? Is that overly simplistic, or is that
No,
kind
I
of
think
where what
that's
kind of
what
accurate?
you just said is 100% what happened. There's always that metaphor everyone uses, the pendulum, and it's going back and forth, and
Yeah.
it's too far to one side, and then someone will point out, hey, that's not accurate. There's a whole bunch of bad things were associated with this, and they start pulling it that way and challenging it, and then, I call it an ahistorical activist perspective on history. Is not interested in looking for balance. It's not interested in seeing that. It's not interested in understanding the limits of what could have been done back then, and it doesn't appreciate change over time or dates or people's. There's just. I think I'd mentioned it before. There's an idea that there's a line drawn in the sand. Everything before that is the past. It all happened at once. It wasn't a linear thing where stuff changes and evolves, and it could have good periods or bad periods. And so as the pendulum swings, then they start to have these ideas which are, they're not rooted in fact anymore. It's just not factual to say that John A. Macdonald created all the residential schools and presided over them. He didn't. He died in 1891. You can't do things when you're dead. At least I'm not aware of it ever happening,
You mentioned that earlier in the conversation at the very beginning too, kind of a detachment from facts. And so do you see that as part of it, that it's like prioritizing a powerful narrative over facts?
Absolutely, I think, because the more this is probably universally true. The more you learn about something, the harder it is to have an extreme opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And you start realizing, oh, okay, well, that's the reason someone had this point of view. Oh, they're coming from this point of view. Oh, this problem. That's what they were trying to solve a problem. They weren't just being evil. People generally aren't like evil. They're usually trying to do something, and they fail to anticipate the unintended consequences of what they do. And that happens now just as much as it did back then. It's not like that's some kind of thing. Oh, those people struggled with bad decisions. We have plenty of bad decisions all over the place, and we don't, in 10 years. Think, what are people going to think about us, let's say in 50, 100 years?
Yeah.
Are they going to think, oh, those people, damn sure we're ignorant. Oh, they won't say ignorant. Ignorant is too kind. They say they knew everything and they could foresee the intense. They could foresee fully the outcome of all of their decisions, and they still went ahead and did them. They're just evil and stupid people, or whatever. Like a bit of humility you have to have when you look back. I don't think there are very many people who would ever willing to make a decision that would result in the torture and death of hundreds of thousands of children.
Yeah.
There's not very many people in our history that would do that. You have your Hitlers and whatever. We all know these names because there's so few of them. That's why. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, we just have to make nuance cool again.
Yeah, we should. I was just talking to someone else about the exact same thing. Without nuance, you don't learn anything, and nothing is ever going to be solved either. And you're not going to foresee the problems in our own decisions now if you don't even appreciate that there was nuance in understanding how something was decided in the past. I don't know. It makes you want to pull your hair out. I don't have very much hair left, and I see. We're kind of in the same boat here, But it's just I don't know. It makes me just shake my head and just wish people would just tone down the rhetoric a bit. It's nonsensical, when I read opinions and I see historical inaccuracies in it, or I see, in order to prove a point, they'll put a quote from 60 to 70 years apart right next to one, and they'll say, see, here it all is, and they just list it all and say, there, it's a universal opinion, I proved it. So no, you haven't proved anything. That's just total. One person lived on a different continent 3 generations before the other person. You cherry-pick some random quotes. That's not solving anything. So I don't know. I wish what I call activist history would disappear. But on the other hand, I don't want to see a return to hero history either.
No, it seems like you're striking a really good middle ground here. And
it's false. when you read it and you open your eyes a little bit, you realize that's false. And if it's false, it's boring and it's a waste of your time. There's no point.
How much of do you think, as a historian, how much of it do you think a country is like a person, that, like, like us too, we don't want to just focus on everything we do good or just focus heavily on our worst spots. We need to be balanced. And, if we want to be healthy partners and people in relationships, you kind of have to balance those things in ourselves. Is that applied to countries too? That can be scaled up?
That's a good question. I never thought of it that way, but that's a good way to look at it. Is, I think, for understanding a history and even a contemporary society, I mean, we should be able to do that. In fact, it's absolutely necessary. You're right about that. Like, I always think of it as the good and the bad and the ugly, and
Yeah.
the truly ugly, right? I mean, everything that happened has some good to it. Everything that happened has some bad to it. And then there's some really, truly ugly stuff going on. And if we're not going to have the courage to admit in our past that it includes all of those things, whatever side of this, whatever end of the pendulum you happen to be on, you got to accept that there's good, there's bad, and then there's the truly ugly. And you have to use the actual data and the information to establish what category it's going to fall into. Because it's not all one category. All three of those things exist. And and the more you include all that, the more interesting it is too. That's my opinion.
Well, here, as we wrap up here, Srephen, you mentioned when we were booking some times here for this that you were booking around your writing times, which got me excited that there's another book in the making here. Is that true? And are you able to speak on it at this point?
It is true, and I'm happy to say it. I've just been working on it. So interested in it. It's called Immigrant Nation, How Canada Became Canada. And it's going to look at all the different, the historical origins of a whole bunch of our early immigrant-oriented communities up until World War One. And so it began with the idea of, okay, I finished my book on the railway. Now the prairies were being flooded with Eastern Europeans and Ukrainians, and were sent out there and told to go farm. They lived in some caves and built sod huts for themselves and almost starved to death. The government brought in hundreds of thousands of them and provided no social services for them. And they were just kind of sent out there and told to sink or swim. And that was a real hardship. But as a result, the prairies were transformed from roving buffalo lands into agriculture and a lot of grain farming. That's a big transformation. But then I started wondering, well, that's not enough to write a whole book on. But what if I look at all the different immigrant communities? And, there's the Loyalists in southern Ontario. They all came rushing north from the United States after the American Revolution. Well,
I think that's in my family. I think we technically could apply for United Umpire Loyalists, one strain of our family.
Yeah, well, see, that's really fun. I find that really, those people, I mean, no offense or anything, and I'm sure you won't take any after all this many of years, but some of those people were darn weird. Fighting a war against members of their own family and attacking and killing their friends and fleeing in order to avoid having democracy for themselves so that they could live under the squashing thumb of a foreign king that they never met.
Well, it's one way of looking at it.
I know. You don't often see it expressed that way, but But then there was the Scottish communities in Nova Scotia. There was the origins of New France. I mean, there was the whole, how did British Columbia get, with the gold rush, who was coming in from that, and
this sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so I just want to look at some of these different early immigrant communities and how that sort of created. I mean, there is no other country exactly like us, with people from all over the place, and somehow, when some of these people came, like on the prairies, for example, a lot of them were illiterate, ignorant peasants from Eastern Europe. They didn't even speak any of their own or write any of their own languages, let alone English. None of them spoke English wherever they were from. So it took generations before there was any kind of a common culture between all these different people.
Well, do you think, it was such a diverse group of people that came into the prairies, and I always wondered if it's amazing that they all got as cohesive as they did and created that Canadian identity. And I always wondered, do you think part of that's related to just how hard it was to get established in the prairies, that they needed to rely on each other, and that's what created that unity?
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, it was very hard. Some of those people barely surviving those early years when they arrived there. Living in dirt houses and hardly any food to eat or whatnot. It's exactly what it is. It's the shared hardship that formed a common cultural identity, but they did not. I mean, that's pretty recent that that existed. Like
Yeah.
it takes a generation for them to have any to shed their religious and political differences, and for their children to speak the same language and have shared experiences around them, and not always be looking to whatever old country they came from. I mean, that's the same in British Columbia with all the people that came in. Lots of them were Americans that were in there, right? Americans from different uh, cultural backgrounds too, and different religions probably. It was true all over the prairies. The loyalists were very different than the people in New France. I mean, these people have absolutely nothing in common, either linguistically, culturally, religiously, economically. And yet somehow here we are in this country. Somehow it works.
Wow. So you are doing a trilogy.
It will be a trilogy, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. That is so exciting.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to hear this. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, already looking forward to it.
I guess I better get writing then.
Well, okay, in that case, I'll say thank you for coming on Bad Canadians. Is there anything else you want to say before we go?
No, other than thanks for having me. It was a great conversation. We touched upon all kinds of different things. Yeah, I hope I didn't say anything bad. That was,
No, you're all good. You did great. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I appreciate your writings. They're just absolutely beautiful. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this new book. So thank you again. Thank you again, Steve.
Thanks. It's my pleasure.
All right. Well, say goodbye, everybody.
Bye now.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe or share with your friends. Bad Canadians, Working Class Roots, A Free Speech Lens, and Canadian Contrarians.